Let's jump over to our switch 1 so we can complete the AAA configuration. First, let's make sure that I can ping ISE server, sourcing from loopback 0 because that's where we're going to be sourcing our TACACS traffic. Okay, which we can. Now the syntax might be slightly different depending on the iOS version and switch platform that you are using. Here we have our Cisco Catalyst 3850 running iOS XE version 3.7. Could have been a .2, I believe. Let's see. Yep, right here, 372. So that's what we have. So here I assume that most of you are already familiar with command configuration with the AAA Authentication Authorization accounting command, so I'm not going to go through that in detail because those do not really change whether or not you use ACS or ISE. For TACACS, what I'm going to do here is just to quickly copy and paste the template that I've already built, and then maybe go through that quickly just to remind ourselves what we are configuring here. Okay, so starting out with the basic username, local username Cisco, purge15 Cisco, that's just for fallback local access when the server is not available. TACACS source interface from loopback 0, then enable the AAA new model if not already. Then we define the TACACS server called ISE_PSN1 for policy service node number 1, given the IP address pointing to our 32.102 IP, which is our ISE here. Using key Cisco that matches the TACACS key that we define under the network devices or settings on ISE. Then just timeout value of 3 seconds. All right, then we create a AAA group server TACACS called LM_TACACS, and then we add a server ISE_PSN1 to it. Okay, just a quick note here that we're doing it by name and not IP. Like I said, that might vary based on your switch platform and iOS version. Okay, we already specify source interface loopback, and then you go through the regular AAA authentication command. Here's authentication login default group. Point to the TACACS group we created, and then fall back to local. Same as enable, fall back to enable. For authorization exec, point to the group, and if authenticated, option to allow the fallback access, and then accounting for exec command 1 and command 15 to our TACACS group. Okay, so nothing fancy here, something that hopefully you should have already seen already. So let's do a quick test for a AAA. Let me bring up that TACACS live log. Make sure you click the TACACS one and not the radius one. So you can do test AAA group LM TACACS. We're going to use our admin user, admin1, password Cisco with the legacy option. Okay, so you can see here it came back and said user was successfully authenticated. If you click refresh, we should see a successful login type authentication that matched the policy set LM device admin that we created, and that's the default authentication policy. Right, we don't see anything populated under the authorization policy column, but that's because if you remember, TACACS authentication and authorization are actually two separate transactions, unlike radius. That's authentication authorizations are kind of happen in a single transaction. Since we only perform authentication here, that's why ISE doesn't really proceed to the authorization policy. All right, we can click into that. You can see here, pass authentication, authentication succeeded. Okay, nothing to look at right now. Then once we have validated that the basic connections is in place between the switch and the server, and obviously the TACACS key has to be matching, otherwise authentication would have happened. So now what we can do is to test Telnet. Again, we're just using Telnet here, although you should never use that in production. So we can Telnet to our switch 1 loopback, which is 172.16.0.10. Get a username prompt. We are logged in with admin1 and Cisco. And now we are successfully logged in. Let me change this to refresh 5 seconds. So we can kind of watch in the background. You can see there's already a successful authentication for admin1 and successful authorization as well. So if you do show privilege, you can see it's purge15 in there because we configure ISE policy to return purge15 for our admin1 user. And you can do a couple show commands here. Config T, get under the interface, and everything seems to be working. It's just because we haven't really gotten to the command authorization yet, so all of the commands that are available should be working for this user. Next, we're going to try the next user, which is support 1. And we're going to type in user's password Cisco, and that's the correct password, but somehow you can see that even though we are expecting the access to be denied, we are still being dropped into the enable prompt. And if we do show a privilege, we're actually being assigned a privilege level 1. Okay, so we're going to talk about that behavior in a little bit, but just make a quick mental note on that. What we expect to be denied is actually results in a privilege level 1 access. So let me exit. This time I'm going to use same support account, but mistype the password. So we should fail authentication here. Yep, there you go, authentication fail. So we'll get some fail authentication log popped up on the background there also. Now I'm going to move along with the local user, local 1. And if you remember, we assigned a password Cisco123 just for this account, and it should force us to pick a new password because we have that checkbox checked. There you go. So enter a new password because it's just going to change it to Cisco and Cisco. I'm going to exit, re-log in with the new password Cisco, right? And I'm dropped right into privilege level 15 as expected. And the last user we need to test here is local 2, password Cisco, and just like support ones, we are not being denied here, but instead dropped into privilege level 1. All right, let's exit and review our authentication log on the background. And it's pretty clear that the authentication authorization process happens separately. As you can see here, when the authentications happens, it follows by the authorization. So starting with admin 1 here, authentication, and then authorization that hits the network admin authorization rule, right? And if we click into that, we expect to see privilege level 15 being returned from ISE to the switch. Okay, authorization reply status is pass. Now with the support 1, successful authentication because we type in the password correctly and the user exists in the Active Directory. But here it hits the default authorization rule, right? That results in an error or failure. If you click into it, status is fail, and it said there's a encounter an error in authorization, and the reason is it cannot find select shell profile. All right, if you remember, we intentionally leave out. Let me see if we can go back to policy set. We intentionally leave out the show profile for the default rule, and that seems to result in the failure, which appears to be correct, but somehow we would drop into privilege level 1, right? And the reason for that is with the authorization failure, as you can see here, auto reply status of error that's being received by the switch. Since we have the switch configured with if authenticated up here, the switch somehow let the user in, but with privilege level 1. So with the if authenticated option right there for the exact authorization, what it means is if the switch receives a failure in authorization from the TACACS group, we're going to let the user in authorized anyway, as long as the user has already been authenticated, which is the case here, but with privilege level 1. So if you have if authenticated option configured under the AAA authorization exact today with ACS and user are being denied correctly, you might wonder what's different here with ISE. So I'll explain that to you. The difference is on ACS, when the user fails show authorization because you have the deny access, if you remember, as your default rule, configured, unlike ISE, ACS return authentication reply status of error instead of authorization. So what used to be with ACS authentication error, now with ISE becomes an authorization error. But when ACS returned the authentication error, technically the user never passed authentication, which means that authorization exact command of the switch is never used, and neither the if authenticated options. And that's why when you have deny access configured on ACS, the user are denied access correctly. In fact, if you look at the ACS log, it will show up as fail authentication, and you actually will never even see the log for fail authorization. So that is Currently, one of the differences between the ISE and ACS deny access per se authorization. So now with that said, what can we do for now to make the behavior the same as ACS? Your first option is to remove the if authenticated option on the authorization exec command. That might not be an easy task though if you have like a large number of devices, plus you lose the ability to do a fallback when the TACACS server is not reachable. Maybe you can also insert the local options right in the middle here, so if the TACACS server is not available, at least you can lock in locally using a local credential instead of using the if authenticated, so that might be an option as well. The other option would be you can configure ISE to return privilege level 0 with the max privilege 0. User will still get dropped into the prompt, but won't be able to do much because in that situation, the user will be locked into just privilege level 0. Although that might change the user experience and it may not work with a device like ASA, so that might not be a good option. So here we're going to try to remove if authenticated and see how the behavior is different. Right, so the command we're looking for is right here. Do no and then remove if authenticated. Now if you go back and try to telnet to your switch and lock in with support one more time, you can see now we are getting an authorization fail, which is basically deny our user access, and that is the correct behavior. Right? You should get the same thing with local 2. And there you go, authorization fail again. All right, just keep that slight difference in terms of behavior if you have if authenticated configure in mind when you upgrade from ACS to ISE. What I'm going to do here is put that command back. And let's go back and finish reviewing the log. So we got the local one that matched our local admin and get privilege 15. So we're good on that. And then local 2 that didn't match anything, fall down to the default authorization rules. And before it got the privilege level 1, and now since we removed the if authenticated or just now as part of the testing, from as far as ISE is concerned, it's still doing the same thing here. It's you basically changed the behavior on the switch side. Right, so currently the way that it's working, if you want to force a fail authorization, you do not select the shell profile. As an additional note here, once you have added a shell profile into a rule, there isn't a way to remove it right now. As you can see, there's no option to clear selection or anything, so just be mindful on that. I believe that might have been filed as one of the Cisco bug, so hopefully in the future you'll be able to undo that. If you have happened to add it, shell profile into the default rules already and you can't get rid of it, all you need to do is just create an additional rules right on top, and that way you can always remove it later if you need to. So here I'm not going to do that. Let me click reset, and now we're back to the way it was. The next device we're going to test here is the firewall. So here we have our console to the firewall. Let me make sure I can ping from the firewall to the server, which I can. Then I'm going to do the same thing here, copying and pasting the template. All right, so we created a AAA server called LM_TACACS with protocol TACACS. I think the accounting mode simultaneous that came from the ACS locking that you need when you want multiple servers to maintain the lock. So I think it's optional. And then we go into the AAA server to define the IP on the inside. So 172.16.32.102. Here we just select timeout of 2 and then the key of Cisco. All right, we removed the current AAA authentication that's pointing to local right now and then replace it with our TACACS server that we just defined with the local fallback for enable HTTP, SSH, and Telnet. Then we enable authorization exec from authentication server, and then accounting on the command, enable SSH and Telnet. Right, and I need to make sure that I'm allowing Telnet to happen from our subnet 172.16. Just allow it for the whole entire 172.16, and then inside. All right, let's go ahead and test the Telnet to a firewall inside interface, which is 10.2 with the user admin 1. Looks like do it again, admin 1 Cisco, and we drop into the enable prompt. If you do show, I guess you type the whole thing. Current privilege is privilege level 1, and I need to manually enter enable and lock in with my enable password. Okay, and now I'm in the privilege level 15, and I can do all the show commands and configuration. All right, and that's because by default the ASA does not honor the privilege level that's being returned from the server, and that's why there's an extra step where you have to manually enable into the higher privilege. All right, now let's try support 1. Cisco. Okay, so with the firewall, it seems like the access is being denied correctly with the fail authorization. I mean, obviously there's no similar configuration like if authenticated on the switcher or router on the firewall. So that's why we were being denied here with the fail authorization. Now let's try to lock in with local 1, Cisco. Same thing, I have to manually type in enable password to get into privilege level 15. Okay, but I'm still able to lock in. I guess I should do this. Maybe I'll filter it for the last 10 minutes. There you go. Yep, so that would be the start of our firewall right there. Testing, all right. So local 1, local account is working 2. Now the last user we want to test is local number 2, password Cisco, and we are being denied access also. All right, said you do not have the admin rights to the console, and you already see the lock being updated for a failure, lock-in failure, authorization failure in the back right there, and the firewall is enforcing it correctly. All right, so just a side note here, if you want the firewall to honor the privilege level attribute that's returned from the TACACS server, you can also do that. So basically make it behave the same way as switcher or router by using the command AAA authorization exec authentication server, and then there's an option at the end for auto enable. Right? The description said allow authenticated user with sufficient privilege to automatically enter the privileged exact mode on login. All right, enter. And now if you go back and try it again with admin 1, Cisco, you can see how we are now dropped into privilege level 15 directly. Right? Obviously, you kind of bypassed the additional security set forth by the additional lock-in step of enable. But if that's the behavior that you want, then you can use the auto enable option. All right, so let me put that back and make sure it got removed correctly. Yep. All right, so let's review the lock real quick. It looks very similar to what we did a test with on the switch. Admin 1 successful authentication and authorization with the network admin. Authorization rule. And this all came from LM Firewall 1. Then we have the support 1 that failed authorization and we were being denied access. And then local 1, we were able to lock in. I guess there are 2 sets of authentication because the second set is for enable. All right, so first is the regular Telnet login, and then you have the enable login authentication authorization. And then local number 2, user was being denied access because of the failed authorization. And then finally, after we enable the auto enable, admin 1's already show up as a single set of authentication authorization because we didn't have to perform the enable authentication anymore. So there's no second set of locks here. All right, so pretty straightforward in the firewall. Everything works as expected, as we set as far as the requirements in this lab. So we are good to go on that. So you can see now that we've gone through the TACACS configuration, at least for the shell profile or shell authorization site, there's a lot of similarity to ACS 5.x, but certainly not completely identical, especially the way that the fail shell authorization is currently handled that could inhibit your ability to deny user access. This is specific to the situation that you have the if authenticated defined. So hopefully this and some of the other issues that we observe here, like missing deny access on the shell profile and the inability to remove shell profile once it's been added from the rule, will be addressed in the future release. Another thing that you might notice is missing here, if you're familiar with ACS, is the policy hit or hit counts, which can sometimes comes into handy, especially when you're troubleshooting something and see if the authentication request is matching certain rules. Although this is not so much of a problem, but a nice feature to have. Alright, and that wraps up our video on ISE 2.0 TACACS Plus Device Admin and Shell Profile. You can visit our website to view an extensive list of our lab videos and sign up to get access to additional lab contents. Thank you for watching LabMinutes.com, and I'll see you guys in the next videos.